In the beginning of the 1960s, America was divided. Segregation was institutionalized across the American South. Millions of Americans lived as second-class citizens, kept down by a system that's chief concern was maintaining the status quo. Jim Crow laws kept schools, public services, spaces, and other amenities segregated. Black Americans were kept from exercising political power with gerrymandering and literacy tests, and found themselves victim to the various legal institutions that were meant to protect their rights. Civil rights legislation had been a failure since Reconstruction, and while progress was made in the Supreme Court, segregation held out in Congress. Southern Democrats in Congress rejected the idea that all were equal under the law and pushed a white supremacist agenda. The Southern Democrats represented a powerful political force, blocking important legislation in various committees and filibustering any legislation that slipped through. While the Southern Democrats in Washington fought against civil rights, local officials enforced segregation through police intimidation and rigged courts. This situation was not without pushback, and grassroots resistance against segregation had begun. Protests forced the American public to pay attention to civil rights and put pressure on a government that had done little for civil rights in the past century. President John F. Kennedy talked about civil rights legislation, but actually implementing meaningful change was another matter. The Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, although not a major player in the Kennedy administration, had been the Senate Majority Leader of the Democratic Party, the same party whose members now block civil rights legislation. This is the story of how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 overcame the entrenched segregationist establishment and achieved the greatest civil rights victory of the 20th century through a combination of popular protest, political maneuvering, and an alignment of circumstance. The civil rights movement had been underway long before the early 1960s, and by now, challenging segregation was not new. Activists took direct action against segregation, defying Jim Crow laws. This was not an isolated resistance, and after 4 African American students sat at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, tens of thousands more would do the same across the nation. This was organized resistance to segregation, and from this, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded. People knew that change wasn't happening in Congress, so they acted on what they believed was right and forced the nation to pay attention to the issue of segregation. The Freedom Rides of 1961 went a step beyond the sit-ins, challenging the segregated bus system across the South. Local towns enforced the segregation laws, sending police to intimidate and assault passengers, but thousands still volunteered. The nation watched images of the riders being assaulted, while civil rights groups continued to organize boycotts and stand against racial violence. It all came to a head, becoming truly unignorable in 1963 when Martin Luther King Jr. organized a march in Birmingham, one of the most racist cities in all of the South. Adult protesters were arrested en masse, and on the later days of the march, children walked in protest. The local police force brutalized the young protesters, spraying them down with fire hoses, releasing police dogs on them, beating them, and arresting them. All of this was captured on film and shown to the nation. The message was clear. National action was needed to end segregation and to stop racial violence. President Kennedy was spurred to action and publicly called for civil rights legislation, making it a national priority for the first time since Reconstruction. This was a turning point for the civil rights movement. The issue of civil rights was now in the forefront of the American conscience. Kennedy pushed for civil rights reform and for an end to government segregation, but he had a barrier: his own party. The Southern Democrats were the biggest supporters of segregation, and many political careers were built on the principle of maintaining segregation. The Southern Democrats would block any civil rights legislation from passing in the Senate, filibustering any effort for change. For civil rights leaders, nothing had changed. Congress was still unwilling to pass civil rights legislation, and little was being done to address the problems experienced by African Americans. In August of that year, over 200,000 people participated in the March on Washington, where MLK gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But it didn't matter. Congress didn't back down, and the Southern Democrats still stood firm on maintaining segregation. And then, On November 22nd, 1963, President JFK was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, and Lyndon B. Johnson, the former leader of the Senate that now stood in the way of critical civil rights legislation, was President of the United States. After the immediate shock of Kennedy's death passed, civil rights legislation was back in the limelight. Many wondered if the new president would continue the national agenda of civil rights. Johnson himself was a Southern Democrat and had never been a supporter of civil rights before. But Johnson had a different plan. Johnson envisioned a great American society, an egalitarian vision in which all Americans enjoyed a great standard of living. Johnson believed civil rights reform was necessary to achieve this vision and championed the Civil Rights Act as the legacy of the late President Kennedy. He was a political expert and knew that capitalizing on the tragedy was the best way to get the bill passed. Johnson addressed Congress, urging for the passage of the bill so that every American would be able to enjoy the rights that were entitled to them. By continuing to oppose the bill, Southern Democrats would be opposing the will of their popular former president. But even with this new momentum, the filibuster still stood, and the bill stayed in deadlock. While Kennedy had been an inexperienced politician, Johnson knew the system through and through and pulled out all the stops to get the bill passed. Johnson met with his political allies in Congress and with civil rights leaders, reaffirming his continued support for the bill. He stood firm on the positions of the bill, refusing to gut the contents to get it passed. Going into 1964, the Civil Rights Act still didn't have enough support to pass, but the circumstances had changed. National tragedy had thrown new momentum behind the bill, and Johnson's leadership gave the bill a real chance. It all came down to whether the president could put together the support to break the resistance of the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats' plan to block the Civil Rights Act was solid. All they had to do was delay the vote with a filibuster for long enough for the fervor given to the bill by Kennedy's death to die down. But Johnson knew their plan, and he knew that time was of the essence to pass the bill. Working with the Senate Majority Leader, the bill was kept at the top of the legislative agenda. Behind closed doors, Johnson intimidated, used every bit of political capital and every political favor he had to build a bipartisan coalition strong enough to end the filibuster with a 2/3 majority of senators. A compromise was made to bring Republicans on board and secure the necessary bipartisan support, changing the wording of the bill as not to allow direct regulation of businesses. Even with this compromise, the filibuster still stood, and the filibuster entered a second month. Johnson personally courted senators on the fence, addressing their concerns, while also intimidating them into falling in line. With the filibuster approaching 2 months, the longest in history, it looked like the Civil Rights Act might fail, even with its popular support. But on day 60, a cloture vote was called to end the filibuster. The coalition that Johnson put together was strong enough to break the filibuster, and the bill passed the Senate with an astounding 71 to 29 senators. The bill returned to the House for another vote, and after its passing, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law on July 2nd, providing national legal protection from discrimination on the basis of race, religion, origin, and sex. The passage of the Civil Rights Act was the culmination of decades of civil rights activism. The sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches all set up the conditions needed to bring civil rights to the forefront of American media and national attention. The efforts of thousands of unnamed activists made it so that America could no longer ignore segregation. Following the death of JFK, LBJ used the momentum to bring much-needed change. The passage of the Civil Rights Act didn't end discrimination, but it did make the government better equipped to take action against it. While the battle against injustice wasn't over, the Civil Rights Act was a big step towards a more egalitarian society.